Hi guys, so today we're going to cover the service virtualization demo along with the UFT and performance center integration. So we're going to get started right away. Right here what we have is the service virtualization designer, and what we're going to do is import the simple web service that is going to give us currency conversions, and we're going to run a UFT test with that, and then we're going to use a web service that converts temperature from Celsius to Fahrenheit and from Fahrenheit to Celsius, and we're going to use that to run a load test. So to get started right away, what we're going to do is click on Learn Existing Service. And you can see that we have two options. If we choose to say, I don't have a web service or a service description, which in case the web service is not actually up and running yet, you can basically create a web service from scratch. So you can select all the protocols that you want and basically what it do, and create your sample request and response, and you'll create a web service like that without even have to have one up and running. There's an easier way, I believe, to do that, and we're going to see that in a little bit. But for this case, we're going to do service description, and we're going to use one of the URLs that I already have here that I've been using. So currency conversion, you can see this is the URL. I click next. This is going to download the description. I'm just going to use SOAP UI, SOAP 1.1, and here I have a little bit of the summary information. So my virtual service is going to be deployed under this endpoint. The real service is going to this endpoint, and this is where my project is. Right now you can see that if I click on change here, it shows me that it's under the embedded server. If I click under that drop down, I will see that I also have the option for my actual service virtualization server. So if I want to deploy this under that, I can select that server right away. For now, what we're going to do is just going to do it on our embedded server and hit save, hit virtualize. Before I do that, notice here that under the endpoint, I can change a bunch of things such as the port, timeout, and some of the basic on general settings that any web service will have. So I'm just going to click OK and discard these changes. I'm just going to leave it by default. Once I click virtualize, I already have my virtual service app and running, and it was that easy. You can see I have a little bit of a summary of where it is. This is my virtual service. So basically my application under testing or whatever testing I want to do, I want to point it to this URL now. This is the real services URL, and once I click OK, you can notice that the virtual service is in learning mode. So we're going to see what that does. First of all, I'm going to stop this, and you can see now the web service is on standby, which means any request that goes through is going to go through this URL, but it's actually going to go to the real web service. So service virtualization is smart enough to know that the virtual service is standing by, it's not up and running, it's not simulating. Even though it's there, we can still go to that URL endpoint, the virtual endpoint, which is this one. And if we set it on standby, then we're actually going to go to the real service. And this is very useful because you don't want to be switching URLs back and forward in your application. You just want to set one URL for your application, and then if you want to use the real service, you can just set your virtual service to a standby mode, and then you'll be going to the real thing. Once you want to go back to your virtual service, you can just click simulate, and now we're going to hit the actual the virtual service. So it's that simple. Before we move on, I'm going to stop this one more time, and notice that I have my data model and my performance model. So under data model, if I hit edit here, I'm going to have my learned data. There's nothing yet, and my default response. So under default response, I'm going to say 0. Whatever I don't understand is going to be returned as a 0. Under my learned data, if I didn't happen to have an actual web service to learn data from, what I could do is very simply right-click and say import message. This is going to give me this wizard in which I can import an XML header and response, request and response, and I can build my virtual service based off that. So it's very useful because, like I said before, in some cases you might not even have your virtual service or your service up and running or completed. But if you have a sample response, you can just use this and a sample request, use that, and then you'll have your virtual service up and running, so you can start your testing beforehand. Now we're gonna go back. I'm not gonna change anything here yet. We're gonna actually use the real service to gather some data. What I want to show you next is the performance model. So if we click Edit, I'm going to have a bunch of settings, performance settings that is going to help. They're going to help me switch my testing and see how my system would respond in a worst case scenario, best case scenario, system breakdown, or any different thing that I would like to know. So if I notice, this is the CPU right now. It's under booster. I have CPU selected. So if I lower this to the lower CPU, my response time is going to be very high, of 1,000 milliseconds. If I max it max, it's going to be just 10 milliseconds. So just like that, it would change and it will show me what my response time would be. I have a bunch of other options, like network-wise. This is just same kind of drop-down. It's going to same kind of slider menu is going to change the throughput. And if I go back to expert, what I will have is a bunch of options together, so I can change something like the throughput, transaction limit, and response time. So if I lower the response time, this is going to be faster. If I make it max, it means the response time is going to be higher, and I can make this as pretty much as high as I want. So notice how my response time is now a lot higher. But I'm going to get it back to normal, and then we're going to switch that in when we run our performance test. We're going to play with the performance model to see how our performance test behaves differently. So for now, what we're going to do is just leave this as it is right now, and I'm going to go to UFT. So I have UFT open here. I'm going to open my currency converter test. It's an API test, and before we even do anything, I'm just going to explain what the test does real quick. So what I have is a web service call. It's calling the web service that I already virtualized. And this web service takes a to currency and a from currency. So I want to know from what currency I want to know what's the exchange rate. I have a data table here with a bunch of from and tos. So I want to exchange. I want to know how much $100 is in Costa Rican colones. I want to know how much $50 is in Costa Rica colones, $5, how many pounds those are, $10 in euros, and 50 pounds to euros. That's basically the conversions that I will be doing. So when I go to the web service, the input parameters are going to be my from and my to from a data source. So you can see that data source.exchange.from is going to give me this guy. And under my response, which is here, I'm just setting a checkpoint saying anything that is 0 or whatever is, if it's different than 0, you can pass it. If it's 0, then that means the test is failing. And the reason why I'm doing that is, if you remember, and we go back to the service virtualization data model that we have, we notice that the default response is 0, which to me it means that if I don't have any data, or if nothing in the data set that I will have, it's there, I'm going to get back a 0 response. So that means that the test is failing from my standpoint. And then I just check if it's 0 and pass the test or fail it. So I already imported this web service. I'll show you that this is the endpoint, and as you can see, this is the same endpoint that I have over here, which is my virtual service. And if I try to import that again, it's just going to tell me the service is already imported, so I can't do it twice. But under my toolbox on UFT, I have my web services, and I can just expand this. And in this case, I only have one call because the web service only has one operation, but I can import this call several times and do it as many times as I want. I'm going to delete this guy and just keep the one that I already had. Now, we've seen how the test works, and before we run this test, I'm going to show you the integration with service virtualization and UFT. So notice that we have the service virtualization button here in the toolbar, and all I need to do is click on that button. I'm going to remove this project that I already had, which is the same one, so we can do it again. Just like that, I removed the project that I had there. And what I'm going to do is say add project this is gonna ask me for a file type of vPrush, which is a service virtualization project. And what I'm gonna do is go back to service virtualization, and I'm gonna save this project, which I haven't saved yet. So I'm just gonna save this project as. On my desktop, I have a virtual services folder. I'm just gonna rename this the right name that I want for it, and click save. So now the project is saved, and what it does is going to create is a bunch of files under that directory. But if I go back to U of T, I'm just going to go back to my desktop. This is the virtual services folder that I had, and notice that there's a big project folder. But I see all files. There's a bunch of other files, but all I care about right now is this one. So I'm going to click OK. Click OK here, and there we go. Now we have our web service and project imported into U of T. If we had more than one web service, then it will show here. As of now, we only have one. Same thing with the data model and performance model. If we had more than one, I should be able to click on the drop down and pick that performance model data model that I want for this specific U of T test. So it's very simple, very easy to modify the data. And if I'm running exhaustive data, I can just reset the data and choose the same data model, and I'm good to go. I don't have to ask anybody to reset data for me. The integration, basically what it does is not only I can control this, but if I click on simulate and then click on deploy, I'm going to show you before I do this, knowing that the web service is on standby mode. If I go here and click on deploy, this is going to give me this green check. If I go back, now this is simulating, which means the web service was started by U of T. So that's basically what the integration do. It not only deploys the web service, so it's up and running for my test, so I know I'm going to an actual web service that's virtualized, not the real one, but I can also change the performance models if I wanted, if I had any. So for now, I'm actually going to right-click here. I'm not going to do the integration because I will be playing with this from service virtualization for this case. So I'm going to stop that. It's going to be on standby. And what I want to show you guys is I'm going to save this test real quick. Now I'm going to run this test just one time. Actually, let me see how many iterations I have. I'm going to lower this to 1. So what this is going to do is going to ask the web service how many US dollars, how many $1 US is Costa Rican colones, and then we're going to multiply that by 100 to know how many colones we'll get. I'm going to run this, and we'll see the output. And remember that the web service, the virtual web service, is on standby. So we're actually going to go to the real service in this case. Even though for U of T, if we look at the output here, let's scroll up. You can see here we have the request, and you can see we're changing from US dollar to colones, and the actual URL is our virtualized service. This is on standby, and 2 messages were received, but these were actually redirected to our real service. So if I look at the results on U of T, everything passed because I got the data back, so everything looks really good. If I look at the request here, let me make this bigger so it's easier. I have the dollars to colones, and that is 531. And then if we multiply 100 by that, that gives us this amount, and we just check on that amount and pass the test. You scroll down, we have the amount here, and that's pretty much it. So this test passed, but if we look at our data model, we still don't have any data because we were just standing by. This was not learning, wasn't doing anything. It was just basically listening for any request and redirecting that to the real service and responding back from us. Kind of like a proxy. So what we'll do is we're gonna go back to service virtualization, and now we're gonna close this. And So you'll see when I close this, the web service is not really running anymore. It's not even on standby. There's nothing listening. So if I run this, in this case it should fail because there's no endpoint up and running. It's trying to go there, unable to connect to the remote server, and the test failed. So you can see here, I tried to send a request to this guy. Since I closed service virtualization, I can't send it, and I wasn't able to go through it. So that's the difference between having a web service on standby and not really running at all. Now, I closed the service virtualization designer, and that's why it's not running. But if I look at my service virtualization server, it should always be running, so I shouldn't encounter these kind of issues. So if I'm going to go to my lab real quick, and this is our service virtualization server. You can see it's a web app that I'm just accessing, and these are some of the web services that I already have imported. This currency control converter, this is another one though, so it's not the same we're using. It's the same web service, but it's deployed somewhere else, so it's on standby. This one is running, simulating, which is the one we're going to use for our performance test. And you can see we already have a couple of data performance models here. So we have a slow and fast performance model and the normal one. But we'll look into that later on. I just wanted to show you how the server looked. If we go back to home, we kind of get like a dashboard saying how many are running, how many messages have gone through, and this kind of looks. It would look better in a client machine, but this is a server version, and the Internet Explorer version is kind of limited, so it doesn't look as good, but it would look perfect in Chrome or any other browser. I can see how many services are simulating, how many I have been deployed, if I have any on learning mode, and how many are in standby mode, and if there's any logged or offline, how many agents as well. So I'm going to go back to services, and then we'll come back to this guy and use that for our performance test. But to go back to our test, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my desktop and open service virtualization. That will take a minute. Okay, so what we're going to do here back in the service virtualization is we're going to open the currency converter project that we're working on, and you can see that data is everything is as it was before. So what I'm going to do is say learn, and I'm going to go back to UFT. Make sure that I run this for the 5 times that I need to run it. I'm just going to execute this real quick. So it went through. Now remember that we were learning, so we're actually going through the real service. If I expand this, all the transactions passed. You can see here, everything went through, everything looks okay. So I'm going to go back to service virtualization. I'm going to say stop. And now all the data that was learned is being gathered by service virtualization onto my data model. So if I look at my data model, I now have 4 sets of data, which is the one from US dollars to Costa Rican colones for twice, so we need it twice, and it's smart enough to know. So basically here I can start modifying my data. I could add another one. What I usually recommend to do is start copying and pasting stuff. So if you want to modify on top of this, you can do it. And you can see here, if you go here, you can say what you want to say, if it's a fault or a good response. In that case, I can save this guy. I can say, you know, from currency to currency, which one it is, and it's going to give me an actual drop-down of all the values that the web service allows me. So I can't just type anything here. So I can say this is going to be that. I can double click here and change that amount to 89.99, something like that, and I'll have another one here. So I can say that this one, that from here, this currency, which I don't really know which one it is, this currency is going to be that amount. And I don't need to be changing the headers because the headers for this case are going to be basically the same. So I'm going to leave this as it is. There's no issue with me adding as many as I want. I close this guy. What we're going to do now, we're going to simulate. So now we're going to the actual web service, virtualized web service. We're going to go to UFT. We're going to run this one more time. And what's going to happen is everything should pass, but now we're actually going through the real data that we have on the virtual service. So everything went through real fast and passed. It actually went really, really fast this time. So we can see here, if we look at service virtualization, we know that we got it again because 10 new messages are here. So I know that we actually hit that service. As you can see, here we have all of them, same information, same response. So now what we're going to do is go back to UFT, actually go back to service virtualization. I'm going to create a duplicate of this data model, create it just like that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this guy, and it has all the data that I already had. So I'm going to remove all of this. I don't need this row, I don't need this row. I'm just going to leave the first row. I'm going to leave the first row, hit save, which is the same. Control S is the shortcut for save, which is what I did. And I'm just going to change data model. So instead of using the current one that has all the data, I'm going to change the one that only has this line of data. So I'm going to say simulate. And now we're using this data model. We're going to go back to QTP. Don't change anything, just run it one more time. What we'll see is that all the data, all the steps will fail except for one. So again, it went through really fast. I can see on service virtualization, you got 10 new messages. So if I look at the results, we can see how it failed. And the only one that passed was this one, because that's the only data that we have. The only data we have is how much 1 pound is in euros, and if we look at service virtualization, how much 1 pound is in euros. The other ones weren't there, so what I got a response was a 0. You can see here, the response was a 0 because that's the default response. So that's basically the part from UFT and how to change the data and modify the data from UFT. We saw how to modify data very easily, import new data, learn the data, and also change between runs and how our test will respond between that. So if I wanted to go back to the other one, it's as easy as just selecting it and say simulating. I'm back to my real data, the one that it should be good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to our Performance Center demo. I already have Performance Center open. I already have a test. I'll show you what this test is doing real quick. It's just one user test. And we're going to be using, I'll show you what the script is doing as well. I'll have VUGen around here. So I'm going to open the script and show you what it does. So here's the script, and what it do is it converts from Fahrenheit to Celsius, a bunch of data that I already have, and just prints it out. So I have a parameter list here, and I'm just all those temperatures. I want to know how much of that is in Celsius. So I'm changing. I'm converting from Fahrenheit to Celsius. That's what my web service does. And if I look at the URL that I'm going to, I can see that under my parameters as well. I'm going to my service virtualization server on our lab. So if we go this one and we look at this guy, this is the same. And we have the name of the server here, but this is basically the same URL that I'm hitting, which is what I have here. So if I run this from here, notice how this has 88 calls. When I run my Vuegen iteration, it should go up to 89. So let's go back, see how actually it kind of goes, I believe for this web services too. So we're now up to 90. And you can see that we were going through this one. So we're going to use this one. It already went through and it told me 50 Fahrenheit are this and the call duration. Now the reason why it told me that was because if I look at this guy over here, the data model that we're using most likely don't have that conversion. So we're going to make sure that we have this one, and I can take a look at that data model and see if it has that conversion or not. I cannot do that from the service, from the server part. I have to do that from the designer. So what I would have to do is open this project on the designer, and I already have that here. I'll open that solution real quick to show you guys. This is a temp convert. It's telling me that it's simulating. This is basically the same thing that I'm looking at on the server. If I look at this data, we don't have all of that. So it's telling me what we do. All right. So now, when I close this guy, I'll need to have the designer open, because what we're going to do is we're going to go direct to our server. Go ahead and run this test right away. And what we'll do is we'll change the performance model on the virtual service, and we'll see how our performance increases and decreases based on the performance models that I already had. Basically, I just tweaked the performance models to have one that was really slow and one that's really fast. So I just made the CPU very fast and the CPU very small virtually, and that's the configuration that we had. So let's get this, give this a minute so this get started. I'm going to close some stuff here like UFT. I don't need that yet anymore. Also going to close Vuegen. I don't need that as either. So this test is getting started. If I go back to my web service under my service virtualization server, I can already see there's some calls getting through. So if I refresh this, I will be able to see more. It refreshes itself at the time. So you can see 96 now and so on. It's just one user, so it won't be too much. You can see the response time is basically 0.1 is the last one. So we're going to leave it running for a second and let the response time kind of flatten down there. Right now we have 3 transactions passed. We're gonna do at least 10 transactions. So we see the flat line here, and then I'm going to make it slow so you see the response time increase, and then when I'm going to make it faster, you see the response time coming back to faster. So remember, this number is 0.01 is the response time right now. That's seconds, so it's pretty fast. Now obviously we only have one user. If we had more users, this would look a lot, the impact of changing the performance model would be a lot higher, but you will still see the impact of it. So it's still very slow, yeah, very fast. I'm sorry, it's still 0.1, and I'll just leave it for 5 more iterations here. So notice that the response time is still flat, that line is flat. Now I'm going to go to my service virtualization browser. I'm going to change the performance model here. I'm going to change it to slow. And I have the option to do a hot swap, which means I don't really have to restart my service. I can just do this on the go. And I'm just going to do that. So once that's saying changing service state to simulating, now this is slow. And immediately I'm going to see an increase in the performance, or actually a decrease in the performance, so it's going to be slower. So whenever the next call comes, you're going to see the last one was 0.1. The next one should be a lot higher. So it's still, you can now at least see how much it took to go from 9 to 11. That meant the increase, and immediately you can see the response time, how much higher this is looking now. So it went from 0.1 to 0.9, and it should stay around 1 second now. So basically the increase was of 100% or more, even more, 10 times. So it's going to stay there at 1 second, and you can see how it went higher as soon as I make that faster, or slower actually, and it will stay that like that. Again, the impact of this is not that much. It's just from, well, it's actually a big impact because it was less than half a second. Now it's almost a second or a second what it's taken to go through. But imagine how much this would show up, how much more this would show up if I had 100 users running this. So the response time would still be lower. Then I make it slow with 100 users hitting my system all the time. It would be a lot slower because one user doesn't really generate any load at all. So you can see how that is a lot higher now. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and switch to my fast performance model. I'm just going to do again the hot swap. Go back here, and whenever the next one goes, notice that the last one was 0.9. So notice how now it's even faster than before. Before over here it was 0.1, now it's 0.074, because I made it really, really fast. That was the idea behind it. And it went up to 1, now it's going to be down there, and I'm going to leave it running there for a couple more so you can see how it's going to stay steady over there. And that's just because of the hot swap that I did. And again, if I wanted to switch back, I'm going to let it go to 20, and then when we get to 20, we'll get it back to the normal performance model, and you'll see how it will return to the 0.1 response time. So 0.07 is the current one. If I do the hot swap to my default performance model, get back to it, we'll see that the next one should be around 0.1 second. And there we go. So that's basically the test that we did, and that's basically the demo that we had so far for you today. We went through how to import the virtual service into Service Virtualization Designer. We looked a little bit of the server part of Service Virtualization. We ran a test with UFT and changed the data and saw how the test reacted to the data change on the go. And finally, we looked at Performance Center and how the test reacted to the performance model changes on the go. So that's all we have for you today, and I appreciate your time, and I hope you had found this useful. Thank you.